Our next talk is from Michelle Casanova, and she is from our our ESAP, our science panel, as well as Federation University and her own consulting company, and several other things to note. Yes, carified expert of the world. Over to you, Michelle.
I wish. Okay. Unashamed spruiking of a book. Our chapter with Lance and Lisa and several other people is called Do We Just Add Water? Wetland restoration. So I'm not going to even refer, well, maybe I'll refer to Ramsar, but it's just not the topic that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about wetland restoration and some of the considerations that we have to make. So, well, no, it takes more than just water, although there are people at the moment doing quite a lot of wetland restoration by just adding water. Presumably it will be somewhat successful, but there are other conditions. We need to have a realistic goal, and working with Jane Roberts and Kay Morris and Phil Pappas on a decision support tool for wetland restoration, we realised first up, what are we doing? What do we want? What are we aiming for? And you have to have a realistic goal and be responsive to changes in that and that might affect it. You need to, of course, just add water, provide an appropriate hydrology, establish appropriate catchment conditions and inputs. And so that will be about nutrients, it'll be about biological connectivity. And then the last one is to manage it into the future. Right there. Okay, how many did I skip past then? There, have a realistic goal and be responsible to change. You're going to be constrained by the landscape and the climate and the changing climate. So you need to have an idea of what vegetation, because I'm a botanist, I think about it in terms of vegetation, but you need to know what sort of vegetation can persist in what you create. Will it be red gums? Will it be cane grass? Will it be charophytes? Will it be something else? And it's going to be constrained by the legacy conditions before you even get started on your restoration. Has the site become eutrophic? Has it become salinised? How much water's been taken away? Can it ever come back? And that's also constrained by resources, not just the financial resources available to you, but the social resources available to you. You need to provide appropriate hydrology, so the depth, duration, frequency, timing of water, presence and absence in the system, and if it's a flowing system, the residence time, how much water is retained, how quickly it moves through the system. And this will be determined by climate as well as any mechanical or infrastructure devices that you have. So when you're looking to restore a wetland, you have to consider all these things. And then you need to establish appropriate catchment condition and inputs, and you need to recognise the linkages between the wetland and its catchment. And they're not just hydrological, where the water comes from, where the water goes, what it carries in it. And you have to look at what the soil types are like, surrounding and within the wetland. For example, in Lake McCowan out here, when we did that sampling, Peter and I, there's this big fat layer of sediment that's been deposited since it was impounded. It's about that, and it's very uniform and grey, all the way down to a very granular wetland sediment at the bottom. So there's been a lot of deposition of sediment. What's that done to the seed bank? And of course biological conditions, the flora, the fauna, the sources of propagules. Lance is finding this now with the growling grass frog and the fish. You've got to perhaps reintroduce things that weren't there. And of course then there's the management into the future. And I was talking about this with my husband, and we've got a wetland we want to restore, and he was saying, well, you know, the idea would be we just block the drain and watch it all happen. It's going to be great. And the mythology of terra nullius, to imagine that this landscape was not actually managed in the past. Well, of course, people did imagine that. They thought it was wilderness in lots of places. But of course, the Indigenous people, and this is where I acknowledge the Indigenous people who did do long-term management of the landscape. In my particular case, it's the Djapurrung people, and what we've got now is a consequence of their management in the past. You need to have your clear strategic goals, in terms of the acceptable limits of change and all that sort of thing. You need to remain motivated to manage something into the future. You need the resources to do it. Going down the list of things that you need to do, and of course it'll come out to be actions in the long run, and you need to be responsive to novel events like long-term droughts or exceptional floods. We call them novel events now, but they might not be. And so I'm going to talk about some of my favourite things here, seasonal herbaceous wetlands. And I've got some on my farm. And when I first moved there 20 odd years ago, I thought, I want to know how to manage these. I want to know what I can do to look after my wetlands. Establishing an appropriate season, goal seemed reasonable. I just wanted to conserve their biodiversity, make them just keep them supporting waterbird habitat and frogs and things that I loved. Providing appropriate hydrology wasn't a problem because they're rainwater fed, and all you have to do is just not damage them, just not drain them. And establishing catchment condition and inputs was reasonable because we owned the land around. So we could say we're not going to put superphosphate onto the paddocks around, we're going to put a buffer zone and things like that. Managing into the future, that's baby steps at the moment. There's a lot of research going on in wetland management. And this is some of the flora that we find in our wetlands, just to break the day with a picture of something pretty. And because people say, I can't actually give a presentation without referring to charophytes, I'm going to refer to charophytes. So this is 2 species that are endemic to seasonal herbaceous wetlands and not found elsewhere. And they have really interesting stories around them. And of course, they all support these big things, bigger things. So frogs, we've got so many frogs. And snakes, some people don't like them, but they're good. And of course, the big landscape level birds. But what's actually happened with this idea of managing seasonal herbaceous wetlands and conserving them? First up, when I got there 20 years ago, I had to say, hey, these are wetlands. Look around. There's so many wetlands in this district. And people said, what? Wetlands? Okay. Go to the CMA. We've got all these wetlands. How do we manage them? What wetlands? Recognition of the problem. Then the next step was to publicise the problem and say, look, these wetlands are actually in decline. People are overgrazing them. People are cropping them. What can we do about it? Get it out there. Get them, nominate them under the EPPC Act. Get them listed. Get them protected. This has been what I tried to do. Raise the profile of the systems. And then part of raising the profile was I had to provide some scientific evidence. And being a wetland botanist, it wasn't a big problem to do some studies on these wetlands myself. Nobody funded it, but I wanted to do it. I needed to establish that they were valuable. I needed to establish that they were being degraded. And so I undertook a few studies and got them published in the international literature to raise the profile. And that worked. They got listed under the EPPC Act. They are recognised by the local CMA. Even some of the farmers know they've got wetlands. So obtaining national protection. Now, the next thing, of course, is finding resources for conservation. Once you get them listed, well, some things do flow from that. You do get some resources available for stewardship payments and fencing and things like that. And implement some of the conservation, and then the management into the future is still a question that we need to answer. And I say it hasn't been successful because it's all still happening. just drive up the road and you'll see these seasonal herbaceous wetlands being cropped. And this, you might think, is a cropped paddock. It's on two sides of a fence, different crops on either side. The wetland's a bit where it didn't take so well. But it's not a very nice wetland now anymore either. So some of the consequences of this cropping, if it's successful and the system remains dry, you have a successful monoculture. That's the aim of it. And you do all these things, herbicide, changing the soil conditions, and they have effects. What have I done backwards? And you kill things, and you destroy habitat, and you change the soil conditions, and you remove the autotrophs, herbivores, and then you end up with a modified food web and a heterotrophic system rather than an autotrophic system, if the system becomes wet. So the people who do crop wetlands are banking on this monoculture, potentially successful, but half the time they end up with this modified wasteland. And these seasonal herbaceous wetlands were once more abundant than they currently are, so they've declined just from the EPBC Act modelling. Grazing's also an issue in this. That is a wetland, it's a dry wetland. And the consequences of grazing are really integral to managing wetlands because they have so many different consequences and they result in community structure change, and they're important. And grazing actually in wetlands, it happens in all wetlands, but not necessarily by hard-hooved European stock. However, the wetlands are pretty resilient. These seasonal herbaceous wetlands are pretty resilient. And it comes down to this. The wetlands I've been working on, this is why I think I'm failing. My wetlands erode there. It doesn't look like it's a very significant component of the landscape of wetlands in that region, and it isn't. But I think because it is just a really shallow wetland, it's becoming rarer and rarer because this is the sort that's most easily drained and most easily modified and cropped. Okay, so for these seasonal herbaceous wetlands, establishing an appropriate strategic goal, well, basically, it's not enough to look after my wetland. It's just like having a zoo or a caged animal. You need a landscape level approach, particularly if you want to conserve some of the landscape level water birds like brolgas. It's not enough to work alone. You have to provide an appropriate hydrology. This is going to be dependent on climate in this region. Get used to seeing dry wetlands. Now, if your friend goes on holidays, it doesn't mean you don't love them anymore. When a wetland dries out, don't lessen your love for that wetland. No? Just because it's not working like it used to, it'll come back from holidays. So get used to seeing them when they're dry, because they'll be dry probably more frequently. Establishing catchment conditions. This is the biggest constraint, and that's land tenure. Most of these wetlands are private land. The vast majority are on private land, and having the social licence to manage wetlands is a problem. And managing into the future, well, we want to know about how much grazing, what sort of animals. Can a cropped wetland actually be restored? How long does it take? The fact that a lot of people are still modifying their wetlands and cropping them and draining them and filling them in, can we change that? How can we change that? Should we focus on smaller clusters and just say, oh, we'll look after this little bit, we'll look after that little bit and bugger the rest? But so obtaining social licence, creating a new social norm is going to be an important consideration in any measure of success. And it has to be part of the solution. And you can have as much strategy, science, logic, publications, books. You can buy water, but you need people to come on the journey. People have been this problem, but they're also the solution. And I think that's what we need to do for wetland restoration. So if it's just add water, we need to connect people with nature more. And it was such a delight to hear Anne talking this morning about how connected she was with nature as a child. And children are easy to connect with nature. Who doesn't like to go looking for tadpoles? And what mother never said, don't come home wet. So we need to connect people to nature so they understand about their role in biodiversity conservation. And we need to provide space for the migration and movement of wetlands and their dependent flora and fauna in a connected landscape. And that's about when it comes down to sea level rise or riparian restoration. It's not enough to just fence off the edge of the river. If you look at the landscape and see there's an enormous floodplain and the river is used to migrating across that floodplain in geological time. And we need to protect and manage any remnant areas before they're damaged, of course. So protect what we've got, but then it may be sufficient to just add water for the restoration, but there are more complicated environmental and socio-political strategies that need to be implemented. And more advised responses and interventions are also required. That's the last sentence of my chapter, by the way. So that's why it's sort of difficult to say. Okay. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Any questions? Yes.
Me again. I just have so many questions today, but from your beginning of your talk, you expressed an interest in personally restoring your own wetland. And the first thing that sort of came to my mind was, is there information publicly available about the types of wetlands that we have in Australia and a community-based publications to provide that information to people to start on that journey in language that people can understand and start to take those baby steps like you did at the beginning? What do I need to do? You know, the identification of what sort of wetland I have, so we come to the end slide which you have, which is about getting people on board, because it's always easier to engage with people who want to participate in these activities, but if those resources are difficult to get to or are non-existent, how do we go from there?
There are a lot of resources available in relation to wetland categorisation, and we've got this decision support tool for wetland vegetation restoration that's publicly available. There's lots of publications and reports that you can use. I know one of the first jobs I had as a consultant for my local CMA was to do a series of wetland information sheets, which most CMAs would have these things. They would and hand them out to the general public and say, this is a wetland, and this is what you should do to protect it or look after it. I think that the information's available and it is distributed at every opportunity that, say, the CMA has. They hand out these wetland sheets or they direct people to their website. I haven't ever had a problem in informing people, I suppose. Just getting engagement has been an issue.
Thanks for a wonderful talk, Michelle. I was just wondering, could you comment on the current incentives that are available, perhaps through the CMAs, to protect these wetlands on private land? And secondly, is there a way to use cross-discipline with sustainable ag to show better returns on farmlands if these systems are intact?
Yeah, there are some wetland stewardship programs and mitigation programs. There are even some companies that offer payments for mitigating wetland loss around the capital cities and things like that. CMAs are a conduit of funds from federal and state government, so wetland conservation has to be on their radar before funds get allocated. So I know in my local CMA we don't have much in the way of state funds for looking after wetlands, but we have some federal funds at the moment. we're having trouble actually getting people to subscribe to the stewardship program, but it's happening. There's lots of barriers, I suppose. One is that farmers don't like to be told what to do, and they say, I'm going to look after it my way, thanks very much. I'm not going to have you tell me I'm not allowed to graze it or whatever. So that might be one of the reasons we don't get that much take-up. What was the second part of your question?
Just maybe using a case study to perhaps demonstrate how an intact system could add benefits to the farmers if they are reticent.
Yes, yeah. Well, at the moment we're in my local land care group. We're looking at precision agriculture to demonstrate that you can modify how you use your wetland, and you can program it into your GPS, and you can get the spray and the fertiliser to turn off while you go over the wetland and turn on when you go back on it, if you install a wetlands layer in your GIS. That sort of thing can work, and because of the losses that you experience from wetland soils, they're often heavy soils, they don't have good water relations, they're either really wet or really dry, and they often yield poorly. If you overlay a yield map on where you've been cropping wetlands, you would see where the wetlands were just from the decrease in yield in a damp year. So getting people engaged in that sort of thing is a long-term process, I think, and yeah, having a program or the funding to do it, that's another thing as well.
One more, Jennifer.
Michelle, you showed a terrific aerial photo of your wetland nested in the landscape and said that you thought that moving to thinking about wetlands on a sort of landscape scale was appropriate. Have you got any suggestions for how that might happen, or who might lead that, or how that could be done?
There has been some work done in terms of wetland connectivity that Andrea referred to by Kay Morris, where she looked at not hydrological, she looked at aerial connectivity, and also there's been a study done just on those seasonal herbaceous wetlands in my region, looking at the connectivity from the point of view of a frog or from the point of view of a brolga. And of course, if you heard from Inca lately, you'll know that brolgas don't use one wetland or even two wetlands, one for nesting, one for flocking. They use a complex of wetlands, and it's really well demonstrated in just up Casanova Road where I live, where we've got them nesting on one wetland, and then we see 3 over there on this wetland and 4 over there, and then a whole 10 of them over this way. They're all using a landscape of wetlands, and so you need to get a landscape level conservation going.
Thanks very much, Michelle. That's all the time we've got questions for.